Okay, so my name is Pi, and this is the first video that I'm um, committing myself to making. I've been working my way into the um, eventuality of creating these series of documentations that more or less brings online a lot of the things that happens in the energy school courses that take place either in Palawan or in different parts of the world that has come about through the journeys of inner dance, mostly for people who are interested in how the trance works, what is expanded consciousness, and why does it even happen? What is its place, and how do we map the incredible amount of information that is sometimes overwhelming that we feel either as emotions or just a tremendous amount of information that flows through our systems. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Now on screen I have these two circles interlocking with each other, with the edges meeting the center of each other. And this is what is called the Vesica Piscis. So I'm going to go over an inner dance model that is called the Vesica Piscis, and it looks basically at the elements of descent and ascent through the mirror of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to be using this as a way of correlating different things, mostly. What is the dream state? And I'm not talking about this in a figurative sense. I'm talking about how do we map out the dream, and how do we exactly understand the dream that goes on whether we are asleep or not. So the inner dance is best described that way. It's a way of dreaming awake or accessing the brain state that is in the REM without having to go to sleep. We're also going to be looking at the near-death experience, or the life review process, if you are familiar with that saying, I saw my whole life flash before my very eyes. It connotes a possibility that we are able to transcend the way we understand time, and even the way we understand memory and normal cognition. How is it that awareness goes there? How is that even possible? And how is that even possible that we are able to facilitate that in an almost automatic sense? So it's perfect that this section or functioning of the nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system, because it's in a sense autonomous and automatic, and we can also correlate this experience to some of those who are familiar with psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience, which has some similarities in relation to both the dream and the life review. And finally, we're going to be looking at the spiritual awakening, whether we're looking at it from the Western or Eastern standpoint. So this is the model. Let me go to the pointer here. So as you can see, the Vesica Piscis is right here. It's a part of a wave. So let's say if we were to look at the actual wave, it doesn't so much look like that as much as maybe it looks like a helix, the way we might be familiar with the DNA helix, for example. But one of the most common ways of understanding the binary wave is light. Light is basically an electromagnetic wave, and that is why we have the letters M, which is right here, and the letter E, which is down here. It's a model that looks at dualities or binaries, and here in this case we're looking at the duality between magnetism and electricity in the way that it stands for, in spiritual terms, the masculine and the feminine. We're going to be looking at that and exploring that further later on. So what this model basically describes is maybe a way of positing an answer to what is the awakening and how does it work. There's a lot of ways in which science validates and affirms this model. I'm not sure what to bring up in this video, so we're just gonna flow, and we're just gonna journey into whatever comes up. So for now, we're gonna be looking at maybe this line up here. If we were to look at the X and Y axis, magnetism stands for whatever holds form together, and you can see that scientifically as the gravitational force or the weak magnetic force, the strong magnetic force. But basically any aspect of either the human being, the cell, the organ, thought structure, there are archetypes that either represents energetic forces, mental forces, emotional forces, and there is then a process of like almost choosing or experiencing either one of two parts. So from experience, in facilitating some tens of thousands of people going into expanded and trance states, the question really is, does magnetism drop? Magnetism is what we might understand as mind, and when we say the words someone is stuck in his or her head, we are basically holding on to that part of us which is formation or form, as opposed to the more feminine archetype, which is an energy that doesn't so much descend, which is this arrow going down right here, or maybe even this arrow going down right here, but it ascends. So it can be as simple as that the process of healing, the answer to the question, how is it that some people are able to heal something like cancer or a migraine or a back problem? How is it that they are able to let go of anything from a physical or an emotional malady, a pattern? And why is it that some others don't? So this is an easy position to hold here. Transformation happens basically when we see both an involution of magnetism, and very interestingly, we're going to suggest to you an observation that has been feedbacked through so much research and so much interactions with countless people from all around the world, that the moment one person is able to let go of their attachments to thought forms, if you will, there is something that arises that either is a figurative thing, meaning it could be called inspiration or passion, creativity. There's an energy that rises up. But from a more visceral approach, when healers more or less work with what we call energy of all kinds. You might call it prana, you might call it life force. Some people might call it ki or chi, Some people might call it the Holy Spirit. There is a curious way upon which something arises in the body. And this might be shared through my body just began to vibrate, or I began to suddenly shake for no reason at all. Curiously, it's very physical. So maybe after an experience of crying, or someone lets go of an emotion which almost has a clarity about it, that I've reached some kind of threshold, and I'm ready to move on. This is what is harder to explain through words, but what is normally better to bring as an experience. If you do wish to know more about that, you can visit this website. This is more or less one of the entry websites to the innerdance process, which isn't so much a dance as much as it is an inner process. But going back to this slide right here, there's something curious that most people aren't actually familiar with. The most curious one being that the body begins to move on its own. I'm going to be bringing up something here. These are the slides that I used during the innerdance energy schools. And what they are is, they're basically maps, okay? They're basically maps. And so if I was going to drop, this is just one of the maps that I use on my own personal process of organizing. Just so many dimensions that normally come up and interrelate with each other, so that it's really quite difficult to talk about the process of brain when we don't bring in the ways in which we hold energy through social interactions, the way we hold networks of information, or the way we hold information as networks, and but also looking at where science and spirit are meeting. That helps us to understand some of the more profound, long-held questions, like the mind-body problem, or the problem between internalism versus externalism. Just different ways of understanding who the heck are we ontologically, from almost all whole system approaches that we have available to us. I just went over this a little bit, and if I could just go back to this. This is more or less like a simplified look at the energies of descent and ascent, to help to posit for some people who are either interested or who have had prior exposure to this mystery of the awakening that very commonly begins with the awakening of the physical. So to understand that more, we need to maybe switch to this slide. So what is the autonomic nervous system? So the autonomic nervous system is more of a functional division of the nervous system. It's not so much a structural division like the central nervous system as opposed to the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system basically describes two functions upon which we relate to the world. And it's very helpful really to understand this if we want to deepen the way we comprehend how exactly healing works. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS for short, as opposed to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is PNS for short, can be described through these basic phrase words. So most commonly we understand the sympathetic through what's called fight or flight. It's that aspect of brain or ways of responding to either an imminent threat or a future perceived danger. So very commonly we understand this as the moment our heart begins to pound more rapidly, or the moment our brain starts to go haywire. So let's look at the brain through the aspect of waves. Yeah. And the sympathetic might be anything in between alpha all the way to gamma states, as opposed to the parasympathetic, which could be anything in between delta to lower alpha, but more primarily theta. And in regards to oscillations, there's the measurement for the parasympathetic could be anything from between 0 to maybe 8 hertz. The sympathetic might be triggered by brain states. It could be anything from between 7 or maybe in 6 to 100 hertz, depending on, I know it's a vast range, 8 to 100 hertz, depending on how much you're able to access even the point of gamma states. During the next video, we're going to be looking at that through the circadian rhythms. But for now, so we have these two functions. It's either we are fighting or fleeing, or we're digesting and resting. Going back to these slides, now with a more or less very basic understanding of how the autonomic nervous system works. These lines describe those two functions to a T. So the parasympathetic is the way in which we are able to allow energy to descend. And it's a paradox really, because it's when energy descends that energy ascends. It's when something goes to sleep that something awakens. It's when something dies, something is born. And you can use this model to understand how either healing, the dream state, the psychedelic phenomenon, the spiritual awakening, the Kundalini rising, even how epileptic seizures take place, different points in the yoga practice, what happens to us when we exercise and then when we rest. There is a way in which energy travels in waves. And we often think that it's going to be one or the other. So there are a lot of people, for example, who make very extreme switches depending on their lifestyles. People who lead very sympathetic lives very often feel the need to go into parasympathetic coping mechanisms. So let's say the more stressed you are at your work, at one point, I need to go on a vacation, or I need to get a massage or something, which is really to shift the brain states to that of something more relaxed. Um, so the concept of homeostasis, which is how to balance out, rather than to imbalance these, how do we balance out these two functions of the nervous system? We only need to partly think about these to begin with, because the autonomic nervous system is autonomous. It's automatic. They affect certain glands. They affect neurons. They affect certain muscles in our body that are more autonomic. It could be the cardiac muscles, for example, or the respiratory muscles, or even some of the digestive muscles are in very directly linked to the autonomic nervous system. In fact, they are linked in different places in different ways through our understanding of the length of the spine. The sympathetic nervous system more or less extends from the middle of the spine, and the parasympathetic mostly are the efferent neurons that extend from the top of the spine and the bottom of the spine. So those who are familiar with how yoga practice and how energy healing works, there are different ways in which we experience energy in those two different areas. So talking about homeostasis, the body does have its own way of balancing out the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Let me see. One of the ways in which maybe we can understand this more figuratively is through the way we categorize drugs or substances that very easily affect our autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic can best be symbolized, as we saw in the earlier model, as an arrow going up, and the parasympathetic might be an arrow going down, very much like going into rest modes, or the ability to process or digest internally held energies. Okay, so sympathetic substances on the basis of drugs might be called stimulants. So maybe the most common stimulant isn't so much cocaine or methamphetamine as much as it is what we drink every day to get ready for the fighting and the fleeing. So we're talking about caffeine. Some people use cigarettes, but almost anything that fires up our neurons to enact the fight and flight responses. Especially were you to have certain coping patterns that are related to how you perceive your environment. So let's say you are surrounded by certain things that threaten you. More or less, you're going to be activating the sympathetic nervous system much more than the parasympathetic nervous system. So in terms of rest and digest, it's when we take drugs that are acting as relaxants. So people think, for example, that marijuana is a depressant. It is not a depressant. Cannabinoids belong more to the third category, which we're going to be looking at in a little while. But the most common depressant that people mostly take is alcohol. So it could be also anything like barbiturates or opiates. Things like heroin definitely are some of the more powerful depressants. So there's a third category of drug that we're going to be looking at, and it's really when we combine these binaries. So that this is how we can understand this model maybe through this analogous discussion. There is a category of drug that activates both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic simultaneously. This is basically called, you probably have guessed it, it's called a hallucinogen. Hallucinogen, more commonly called the psychedelics, the psychedelic phenomena. There are multitudes of research that describe how certain people are able to take psychotropic substances or synthetic ones that bring about this heightened awareness, which can be experienced through visions, ESP, expanded out-of-body states, or visions of the world as color, sensations of the world as energy, even like a sense of deep connection. So whether it be LSD, magic mushrooms, PCP, ecstasy, I'm not here to excite us to maybe crave for the next hallucinogenic fix. The point of this discussion is to bring up certain analogies that helps us to understand how trance states and expanded states really work. So the inner dance is a very good way of understanding this because of the way in which we use sound. So we're going to be going into this model later on, but for now I'd like to point out that there are these different brain waves that we discussed. So down here would be more of the depressant brain states, the parasympathetic brain states, as opposed to the sympathetic stimulated brain states. So let's say you had 10 cups of coffee, probably oscillating somewhere around here. Let's say you just drank 3 bottles of beer, a glass of wine, and it's 12 midnight or 2 a.m. in the morning. Maybe you're oscillating somewhere here, heading towards something very deep. And you basically go through these states during the circadian rhythms that happens every night. So our discovery in the inner dance is that when a body and a mind and a human being is exposed to several elements that journey them through certain brain states, there is a pattern upon which descent and ascent work with each other. And it's a very curious thing. But we would have to maybe look at the circadian rhythms to really understand it. The REM is basically the dream state. And how dream comes about is when the body is oscillating at a very deep delta. You know, like especially here during the M3 stage, the non-REM 3, before you're able to enter into the dream state, you have to shut down certain active parts of the body. So there's a part of the body that really drops down, really relaxes. But it's called paradoxical sleep because the moment you're able to do so through M3, your mind is actually awake. So your brain is oscillating at delta state. And this is a fascinating wisdom set. Like even the people who are studying optimal or what's called flow states, they realize that it's when we experience extreme beta or gamma alive states, you know, very, very rapid oscillations of passion, heart, and inspiration, excitement. But this can only happen when we hold this excitement in expanded theta, what they call a substrate of theta waves. or somewhere between delta and theta. Theta being more or less like a state of drowsiness, whereas alpha or mu might be somewhere around daydreaming or happy, joy. Going back to this, it's very synonymous with this model. What we realized, and we can back this with quite a few scientific affirmations, and maybe we can find space and time to do that later on. It's when we expose the human body to certain conditions that allow them to let go and relax, that energy and vibration begins to awaken. And that is what some people might call the awakening of intuition. Certain visions come about. There is an overwhelming sense of euphoria. Certain maladies, illness, whether it be physical or emotional, goes away. And many things that are really just locked in the human body just leave. They step out the door. You know, they go on a vacation. They take a break. So this is a very big topic, and I don't think I need to go into this too deeply. For now, maybe this serves as an introduction into this set of videos that I'm going to be working on in the next months, that more or less, hopefully, unravels and unpacks the maps that are unfolding and unraveling through the inner dance process in ways that it might contribute to cognitive science and the philosophies of mind, and not just cognitive development, but finding transcendence models very gently emerging from both sociological and highly individuated environs. So bringing this up again, I'm going to be going over some of these boards that I normally go over during during the many energy schools that happen around the world and in Palawan, which is really something that got co-authored by the world. You know, like I've listed down the nationalities that have been able or honored to witness going into heightened states. You know, people I was able to train and facilitate, more or less like 20,000 people. So I'm talking about maybe 60 nationalities that have been through inner dance around the world through me. I'm not even counting the people who have been facilitated by all those amazing teachers out there. So what this basically talks about is heightened pattern recognition, that when you do find the chance to look at the vast amounts of research that certain people who work in the same field that I do and are exposed to so many people going to the world of the archaic, the mythical, the magical, you know, like there's a lot of feedback that comes back to us that doesn't just affirm certain things that we already know, but basically looks at ways of understanding the mind that aren't just old but also new, with the idea that we're not going to be the same beings in the next decades or centuries or millennia. That it doesn't take that much changing the human DNA, just like it didn't take that much to shift a minuscule amount of the DNA of the chimpanzees to become what we seem to be now. which is what we call Homo sapiens. It doesn't take that much to bring emergence about. So I'm looking forward to maybe going over some of these boards and seeing what exactly they mean. Founded primarily first on the Vesica Piscis, and how descent and ascent through the ways we understand the sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous systems work. I'm going to leave you with one last bit, which is founded in this board. What is change and what is transformation? One of the reasons why I show you this map is to hold the awareness of what is called whole systems. That sometimes we experience whole systems, and this is what we say when it feels good. Like, this is amazing, this is ecstatic, this is euphoric. But when we look at the actual maps, and this is really just one of the maps that I'm using, there are many more in my notebook. This is one of my personal maps that I need to use to see how the different content that I research into and share with other people interlock with each other. This isn't so much just experiencing whole systems as much as it is perceiving whole systems. That we're not just here to experience and feel, but we're also here to see, to understand. It's the ecstatic experience of seeing. It's that aha moment, which does tend to come about the more ascension and descent takes place, evolution, the more involution and evolution takes place. We eventually find some kind of meeting point, but which has to sometimes journey into a 0 point where magnetism, as much as it could, descend, and electricity, which is intuition, ascends back to where it belongs. It at one point will meet somewhere here in the middle, which connotes here in the green, what we call the green dimension, the heart chakra. Sorry, I didn't get around to it. One of the most important things we're going to be looking at was affirmed by the work of a neuroscientist who does quite a bit of research. His name is Kevin Nelson. He's a doctor. I think for now he's practicing in Kentucky. He wrote a book called The Spiritual Doorway of the Brain, and in this work he describes how the life review, this experience of I saw my whole life flash before my very eyes, takes place precisely when, let's say, during the near death, I'm about to die, we inactivate the sympathetic, and suddenly I'm going to die anyway. There is a possibility of surrender or letting go. And then, boom, like suddenly, there is this amazing life review where they speak of this notion that I'm seeing my whole life flash before my very eyes. So there was a famous YouTube video, I think, her name's Jill Bolte Taylor, who describes the experience of the stroke. She's a neuroscientist who experienced a stroke. And one way we can understand this binary is the left and right hemisphere of the brain. So when she experienced this right hemisphere nonlinear parallel processing, instead of the sequential logical moment by moment, word by word way of perceiving the world, there was this amazing sense of wholeness. And then she saw the many parts coming together, and it was just very hard to put into words, but there are many documentations through people like Kevin Nelson and on how we are able to witness our entire existence in the span of maybe even less than a second. With that, I leave you with the notion that we do not have to die in order to experience our life review. That there are certain conditions upon which we are able to bring about a sensing of the whole, the awakening of the Vesica Piscis, which is shaped like the human eye or shaped like the leaf. It is also the Mayan glyph for zero. That there are spiritual notions that are coming into the world today, that it is actually possible to become aware of all of it. And that's a process that we're going to be tackling that has different names, different monikers, different byways. So before diving into deep, I'm just going to thank you for allowing me to share this with you, and I hope that I could spend more time on these sharings and be able to give these as freely as I would like to. So thank you for co-journeying, and hope to see you again. Goodbye.